As a player at Clemson would be practicing, and on a weekend he'd slide over there and take some guys over the side, and they'd be shooting for nickels. Kind of a little cocky kid.
He'd run his mouth up on the court and deliver. I'm gonna whip you tomorrow, pulling their pants or doing something. He was just aggravating. He just loved to have fun. I remember playing a lot of horse with him.
People want to play horse with you.
We would play horse.
He invented more shots.
One of the shots that I could never do was
spinning the ball off the elbow, spinning the ball off the head.
Go through his legs, around his back.
Spinning the ball and off the knee.
Spin it off his finger, bump it off his head.
Around the back at midcourt.
Close his eyes and score.
He could make 3 out of 5 consistently from half court by throwing the ball up in the air and it bounce around the foul line and bank in.
By the time he had reached junior high, Pete had mastered the game well enough to play varsity basketball at Daniel High School. It was an amazing accomplishment considering his size.
He was 11 or 12, absolutely scrawny, just tiny, no meat on his bones. I mean, you wondered how he could even run because he had no muscles, seemingly.
We're standing out in the hall talking to the high school football coach, and he said he had a Charlie horse. The coach told him, says, Pete, that's impossible. You can't get a Charlie horse on bone.
He was so small that the other teams wouldn't put anybody on him to guard him. I mean, it was a joke putting this little squirt out there on the court. And yet he would go down the court and he'd shoot off of his hip.
Pete was not strong enough to shoot a jump shot. He shot like he was drawing a holster. But Pete could score. To give Pete a 28-footer was giving him something he could do 7 out of 10 times.
And you would think, well, I can block that. So you go out to block it. He went around you.
But the high hopes for Pete's basketball were almost derailed by his low self-esteem.
He wouldn't ever come to practice on time. It drove the coach nuts. He finally realized that the older kids were giving him a hard time because he was immature physically, and they'd make fun of him. So he never undressed in front of the team. Gosh, when you're in the 8th grade, you're 12 or 13. These guys were 17 or 18. Well, he was a kid to them, a child. I'm sure he was terrified, but he never showed it. And the coach said, scoring this many points, who cares if he's 5 minutes late?
Like Pete, Press had success too, and that meant moving the family again, this time to Raleigh, North Carolina, where he took over for the legendary Everett Case and led NC State to the ACC championship. But having a new address wasn't the only change in Pete's life.
I went to a Clemson football game after they had moved to Raleigh. This guy walked up to me, towered over me. I'm 6 feet, and he towered over me, walked up to me and says, "Hey, Coach Bagwell." And I kept scratching, who is this guy? "Coach, you don't remember who I am?" He said, "I'm Pete." I couldn't believe it. He'd gone about 5 or 6 inches, just boom, just like that.
Pistol Pete grew to be like 6'6", with arms that made him 6'7", 6'8". But his size enhanced his skills immensely.
By his junior year, Pete had moved on to Raleigh's Broughton High, where he elevated his game and electrified the crowd.
He averaged 33 points, went over 47 points 4 different times. At that time, he wanted to be the best basketball player in the world, and he did everything he could do to achieve that goal.
He could play in the ACC or anywhere in the country as a senior in high school.
Pete's exceptional talent made it especially hard for the North Carolina State coach to evaluate incoming players.
We would bring recruits in, and he would call me every week. We got any recruits coming in? I said, yeah, we got 2 coming in Friday. So that meant Saturday morning we're going to play. And Pete and I'd play him 2-on-2. We'd play about 5 games and mix it up, and one of them would always be guarding Pete. I remember going back to his dad. We beat him 21-5, you know. He's this. And we turned him down, didn't offer a scholarship. This guy goes on and makes all Big Ten.
Basketball was his whole life. He didn't have a great deal of a social life.
I really think he only had like 1 date in high school, and that was a senior prom, and I think he took the young lady home early.
He would watch the pro game of the week every Sunday when he was in high school and the prep school. Then he would come and actually seek out players. He'd come to your apartment out in the married housing there at NC State and wanted to play. I coached basketball 32 years. I've never been around any human being that take the game as seriously and have a passion for it like Pistol Pete Maravich.
When he was in high school, he would come to my camp in the summer. I thought he would wear himself out because he'd do all those ball handling drills. And I said, Pete, you're going to burn yourself out, man. By the time the season gets here, you're going to be so tired you won't be able to play. He said, Coach, I'm going to be a millionaire. That's my goal. I'm going to be a millionaire. I'm going to be the first guy that ever signs for $1 million.
Up next, Pete moves on to college at LSU, and Showtime takes on a life of its own. In 1966, Press Maravich was on the move again, leaving NC State for Louisiana State University. Although Pete could have played at any college, Press made it clear to his son that his choices were limited.
I make my living coaching college basketball. He said, I'm living downstairs from the finest high school recruit in the country. Why shouldn't I recruit him and use every tactic I can to get him?
He said, sign this. And I said, what is that? He said, that's a scholarship to LSU. I didn't know LSU even existed basketball-wise, and they really didn't at that point. But he said, sign this. And I said, you got to be crazy, Dad. He says, if you don't sign this contract, don't ever come home again.
Press would ultimately get his way, but he would have to pay a bit of ransom.
I was sitting in the living room talking to his dad about his move to LSU, and the phone rang, and Coach Maravich actually answered it. He said, Pete, it's for you. This call was from West Virginia. The coach was Bucky Waters. He was recruiting him to go to West Virginia. And all these coaches were saying, if you don't go with your dad, we would love to have you. And he finished that conversation that day, and he walked through. And Coach knew who he had been talking to, and he said, what Bucky have to say? Pete said, oh, we had a good talk. He said, it sounds good up there. And he said, good my rear end. He said, you ain't going to West Virginia. Pete turned around and said, Dad, I told you I ain't going to LSU unless I get a car. And fast forward 6 months, and out of the clear blue, he said, finances are killing me. I'm broke again. I said, broke? He said, I got a house payment. I got 2 car payments. I said, 2 car payments? He said, yeah. And I said, what's the other one? He said, I got Pete a car. So Pete got the car.
He said, you're going to see the greatest basketball player of all time. This was a father talking about his son. I couldn't believe it.
I was recruited by his father. And when you're in high school, you know, and somebody's recruiting you, you always think they're going to tell you how great you are. But I never forget Press Maravich telling me the biggest privilege I would have would be to play with his son, Petey.
The first time I saw him was on campus, walking around the quadrangle. It wasn't hard to spot who Pete Maravich was. Floppy hair, tall, skinny, 6'5" kid. Back then, freshmen didn't play on the varsity. His average in his freshman year was in the 40s. The buzz around town was, you better get there early, because you may not get a seat.
They would be lined up for an hour and a half or 2 hours before the game his freshman year.
It changed the eating habits of people in Baton Rouge, because the varsity started at 7:45 and freshmen tipped off at 5:45. So what you had to do to see the freshman game was skip supper.
They'd be there at 5:15, packed house, over 11,000 people.
And after the freshman game, the place would empty out, and the varsity might have played before 800 or 900 people.
That's exactly right. I was on the varsity, and as we were warming up, people would be filing out.
So you knew something special was going on.
A year later, Pete moved up to the varsity, and LSU basketball was never the same.
They would turn the lights out at LSU. They'd come on the floor, he'd come out, spit on the basketball, and it was showtime. Carnival atmosphere, Mardi Gras, Pistol Pete Maravich.
The worst feeling I've ever had in my life, other than a letter from a divorce lawyer, was going down to Baton Rouge on Saturday night, going into that crazy cow palace they had with 10,000 half-drunk Cajuns, and knowing you had to hold their hero under 50 points. It was just a bad feeling, believe me.
Some of his shots were experimental. You never saw these things in practice. He'd just all of a sudden just come up with something. You're at the top of the key and you get by your man and you have the big center right there, and instead of shooting it, he throws it up against the backboard. The immediate reaction of the rest of the players is to turn and look. He catches it off the backboard, and as they come back, he slips right by and puts it right in for a layup. As he turns to dribble down court, there's a defender right there in a defensive stance, this close. And he turned and he put that ball through that defender's legs, circled him, and kept dribbling. The defender's just
don't think he ever shot on balance in his life. He was always following one way or another. He would shoot leaning shots. And when he got hot, you could forget it. You were not going to stop him.
Well, he's just an excitable boy.
I had an opportunity to guard Pete. We held him to 17 points in the first half in that ball game. We were really proud of that. Unfortunately, he got 41 in the second half.
We were playing Tulane down there, and their coach kept yelling, make him go left, make him go left, you can't go left. They held him to about 60 points that night, so obviously you could go left.
And you got to remember, that was with no three-point line.
The numbers he would have rung up would have been frightening. Conservatively, you'd have to give him 10, 12 points a game more, which gets him up into 55, 56 points a game, which is absurd.
He was the best passer and ball handler I have ever seen. He made some phenomenal passes. Behind his back.
Around his head.
Between his legs.
The blind passes.
He'd drive people crazy with the way he could pass the ball, and especially his teammates.
His teammates had marks all over their bodies where the basketball hit them when they never knew it was coming.
I always used to joke, the only time that you really have to watch Pete is when he wasn't looking at you. If he was looking right at you, you're not going to get the ball, but as soon as he turns, you may get it.
The more he got the crowd revved up, the more sensational his passing and his ball handling became.
At LSU, Pete was the show, the sole support of an average team. He outclassed the competition, although there were times when the competition in the all-white Southeastern Conference wasn't all that challenging. So Maravich did whatever he pleased, and more often than not, what he did defied description. Pete was not shy. With Press's blessing, he took an amazing amount of shots. In his first varsity game, Pistol fired up 50, and only once in his sophomore year did he take less than 20. But in being as much of a showman as he was a player, Pete Maravich brought the LSU basketball program out of the dark ages and into the national spotlight. Coming up, Pete takes Showtime to a higher level and becomes college basketball's all-time leading scorer.